The galaxy ruled to ban Earth. Humanity shrugged and simply vanished. The vote passed at midnight, and no one in the gallery screamed. That was the wrong part. Yara Oi had watched 17 planetary expulsions in her career. She had stood in this same amber-lit gallery when the Keth was stripped of lane access, when the Bruvon were reclassified as non-sapient trade goods, when a species called the Velmir simply stopped showing up one session and no one asked why. Each time, the expelled party had done something predictable. They had wailed, they had threatened, they had bargained with offers that shrank by the minute until someone found them a smaller room. The Velhari expected the same from humanity. They had not planned for the silence. Yara stood in the high gallery of the amber chamber, her back straight, her paper journal open across her forearm. Below her, the Conclave's floor delegates were still watching the vote tally scroll across the central display in their language, because the translation buffer had not yet updated to handle the word they had just used for humanity in the final clause. Yara had studied enough unfiltered Velhari syntax to understand the clause without the buffer. She wrote it down in her journal, word by word, in the cramped script she had developed during her first posting on the outer stations. She rolled her silver signet ring around her thumb and kept writing. Councillor V floated forward on his hover dais at the chamber's center, his coral carapace catching the amber light in a way that made him look, briefly, like something beautiful. His translucent fin folds had gone pale. After a vote like this, they should have been flushed deep crimson with the satisfaction of a concluded negotiation. Pale meant something else. It meant that even Councillor V, who had spent 11 years building the coalition that made this vote possible, was waiting for the human delegation to do something he could respond to. Yara closed her journal. She uncapped her thermos. The customs inspector 2 rows below her went rigid. Its sensory pores flared wide, scanning the air. It had made the same movement every morning for the 3 weeks Yara had been stationed in this gallery, and every morning it had reached the same conclusion. Unclassified biological agent, non-weaponized, origin uncertain. It had filed the same report each time. The reports had been archived under pending classification, human beverage, priority low. Yara drank her coffee. It was dark roast, unfiltered, grown in a pressurized soil dome on a transit platform, because the outer stations did not carry the real thing, and she had stopped pretending she could tolerate the synthetic replications. It tasted like burnt bark and something almost sweet underneath. It tasted like home. She poured a second cup into the lid, set it on the gallery railing, and watched the chamber below while Councillor V finished his remarks. She did not hear the remarks. She already knew what they said. Stay close. I need you to hear how this ends. 3 weeks earlier, the transit logs had shown something nobody in the Conclave had flagged as significant. Humans had been filing surplus inventory returns for 31 days without a single counter-request. Not reduced requests, not renegotiated contracts. Returns. Clean, documented, fully compliant returns of equipment that humanity had previously been contracted to maintain across 47 freight corridors in the central core. The Conclave's logistics office had processed them. Of course it had. The Velhari Trade Authority ran the most efficient administrative machine in the known galaxy. Forms were filed. Confirmations were issued. Nobody looked at the pattern because the pattern looked like compliance, and compliance was what the Velhari rewarded. The day the vote passed, 38% of all intersector trade channel stabilizers across the central hub were running on human-manufactured joints that humanity had, 3 weeks prior, already begun to recall. Yara had written that number in her journal in the first week. Just the number, circled once. She had not told anyone. She had not needed to. Oliver Crane had already seen it. He ran Geneva's out-of-deployment office with a mechanical pen that he used to sign documents even when the digital record was sufficient, because Oliver believed that a signature made with a tool you carried in your pocket was a different kind of commitment than one made with a stylus you picked up and put down. When his response to her preliminary report arrived via secured typebeam, it was 4 lines. Numbers received. Protocol confirmed. Begin the formal notification sequence. Do not apologize. Yara had read it 3 times, poured the rest of that morning's coffee down the station drain because it had gone cold, and gone to pack her journal. The Conclave's lower gallery was not designed for crowds. It was designed for witnesses. There was a difference, and the Velhari understood it the way a coral reef understands current, by shape, not by thought. The chamber's acoustics pushed every sound upward and outward, toward the high tiers where observers like Yara stood, so that the weight of proceedings could be felt as a physical pressure. The amber lights were set to a frequency that made Velhari carapace pigments intensify. The floor was calibrated to transmit vibration from the dais, so that even the furthest row felt the hover platform's movement in their feet. All of it was designed to make the entity at the center feel large, and the rest feel small. Yara had brought a cushion from her quarters on the first day, a thin one, green, made from recycled insulation padding. She sat on it every session, which put her eyes 4 centimeters above the gallery rail, which meant she looked straight across the chamber instead of down at an angle. She had not planned this as a statement, but the Velhari clerk assigned to monitor the gallery had filed 3 separate reports about the cushion in the first week. Now, with the vote sealed and the amber lights cycling down to their post-session low, the chamber began to empty from the bottom up. Floor delegates filed out along the exit channels. The junior administrative staff processed their record. Counselor V floated toward the sealed consultation suite at the chamber's rear, his fin folds still pale, still moving with the mechanical precision of a man completing a task rather than celebrating one. He had not looked up at the gallery, not once. Yara stood, tucked her journal inside her coat, and poured the last cold swallow of coffee onto the gallery floor. The customs officer below her whipped around at the smell, sensory pores wide open. She capped the thermos, nodded at the officer with the precise degree of courtesy that her protocol training called respectful acknowledgement, and walked to the gallery exit. She had one more thing to do before she left this station. The Velhari Trade Authority's formal handover room was not a room built for handovers. It was built for signings, which was a different thing. A signing was a final confirmation of terms already negotiated, conducted under the amber lighting, and the acoustic pressure designed to make the signing party feel the moment's weight. A handover implied that something was being given away, and the Velhari had not previously needed a room for that, because in 40 years of governance, they had never received one. The table was long and black, and made of a synthetic resin that absorbed light without reflecting it. There were 7 chairs on the Velhari side, occupied by the 7 trade ministers who controlled the freight protocols for the Central Core's primary corridors. Counselor V sat at the center. His fin folds had returned to their resting transparency, which meant he had composed himself in the consultation suite, which meant he had also spoken to someone and decided on an approach. He was going to offer a partial reinstatement. That was what the pale fin folds becoming transparent meant. He was going to be generous. Yara sat down on the human side of the table, alone. She set her thermos to her right, her journal to her left, and a physical drive in front of her. The drive was black, the size of her thumb, and unremarkable except for the white label on its side. The label said, in the Velhari Trade Authority's own administrative font, Corridor 7 Alpha, Full Transition Documentation. Counselor V's hover dais hummed quietly. His 7-fingered hand rested flat on the table. He had not expected her to be alone. Ambassador Oe, he said through the translation buffer, we acknowledge that the vote was conducted under the full provisions of the Assembly Charter. It is our intention to discuss a structured transition arrangement that would allow human personnel to. Yara pushed the drive across the table. That is the complete handover documentation for Corridor 7 Alpha, she said. Inventory reconciliation, maintenance schedules, component sourcing maps, emergency repair indices. Everything your technical teams will need to take over operations within the standard 90-day window. She reached into her coat and produced 6 more drives. She lined them up beside the first one. Corridors 4 Beta, 9 Gamma, the full outer arm cluster, the junction hubs for transit sectors 14 through 19, and the stabilizer maintenance grid for the central processing relay. The 7 ministers had gone completely still. Counselor V's fin folds flushed the lightest edge of crimson, not the deep satisfaction flush, something faster, something that moved the way water moves when it suddenly finds a crack. These are complete operational handover packages, Yara said, not exit frameworks, not reduced service agreements. We have completed full documentation for every system humanity is responsible for maintaining in the sectors covered by the Assembly's jurisdiction. The transition windows are inside each package. The emergency contacts for human technical staff who have volunteered to answer questions during the handover period are also included. There will be no gap in your records. She folded her hands on the table. We want to make this easy for you. The room did not move. Clerk Tav, the young coral-skinned scribe stationed at the far end of the table, had gone very still. His respiratory vents, which had been cycling at their normal pace since the session began, were not cycling anymore. Counselor V looked at the 7 drives lined up in front of him. Then he looked at Yara. You are not requesting a counter-negotiation, he said. It was not a question. No, Yara said. Counselor V's 7-fingered hand remained flat on the table. He was calculating. Yara could see it in the stillness of his fin folds, that particular frozen quality that meant the administrative processor behind his eyes was running a search and not finding results. She had watched him calculate before. Usually it took less than 3 seconds. He was a fast mind inside a slow institution, which was the most dangerous kind. This was taking longer. The transition documentation, he said finally, covers operational continuity for the assigned corridors. It does not address the question of ongoing human presence in advisory capacity, which the Assembly's resolution does not. The Assembly's resolution removes human personnel from all jurisdictional space within the Conclave's recognized boundaries, Yara said. We are complying with that resolution. The documentation ensures your operations do not fail during the compliance window. It would be inconsistent with our position to leave your infrastructure unsupported. She let a short pause sit in the air. We have always honored our commitment. The fin folds moved, just slightly. The crimson came back at the edges. Counselor V understood what she had just said. He was fast enough for that. She was not asking for exemption. She was not asking for anything. She was doing exactly what the resolution demanded, with the kind of thoroughness that left no legal gap for the Conclave to claim bad faith, no administrative irregularity to point to, no record anywhere that humanity had resisted. The paperwork was spotless. The compliance window was generous. The transition guides were so complete that a trained Velhari logistics team could take over operations with no gap at all, which meant the Conclave could not, in any legally defensible way, ask humanity to stay, and which also meant that when things began to fail, and Yara's journal had 17 pages of notes on exactly which things would fail first, and in what order, and by how much, there would be no record anywhere that humanity had been unwilling to help. Ambassador Oe, Counselor V said. His voice was still level. The Silicon Collective's junction stabilizers in sectors 14 through 19 are on a maintenance cycle that requires round-the-clock biocalibration checks, Yara said. Yes, that protocol is on Drive 6, along with the emergency response indices. The calibration sequences have been translated into Keth mathematical notation since the Silicon Collective prefers it for technical documentation. Your teams will find it straightforward. Clerk Tuv's respiratory vents made a small sound. Not a word, just air moving through coral tissue in a way it hadn't before. Counselor V looked at the 7 drives again. Then he looked at Yara for a long moment, and his fin folds went flat. You have prepared for this, he said. We prepare for everything, Yara said. It is how we are built. The Conclave Station's botanical intake bay smelled like minerals and filtered atmosphere, the same as every other corridor in the complex, except on the mornings when Clara Holt wheeled her equipment cart through it. Clara was a xenobotanist attached to the Human Cultural Liaison Office, which was a title that meant she kept the terrestrial plants alive in an environment not designed for them. She had been doing this for 6 years on 4 different stations, and she had strong opinions about humidity gradients and weak opinions about almost everything else. She was moving a cart stacked with vacuum-sealed tins of black soil through the intake bay when the vote result hit the station network. She finished stacking the tins. She sealed the cart's locking arm. She went back to her quarters, opened her personal file system, and pulled up the document that the liaison office had circulated 11 days ago under the subject line pre-departure botanical protocol, compressed timeline. She had already started the route cutting. She had started them the day the document arrived, because Clara did not wait for things to become urgent before she did them. The terrestrial succulents were already potted in transport soil, already sealed in low-moisture containers, already tagged with the handling codes for zero-gravity staging. She loaded them onto the cart. One of the Keth corridor monitors observed her doing this. It stood in the entrance of the intake bay in its segmented black carapace, motionless, the way the Keth stood when they were processing something that didn't fit their existing categories. Clara nodded at it, the way she nodded at most things, and pushed the cart through the far door. The monitor filed no report. The Keth did not file reports alone. The Silicon Collective's representative did not have a name in any language the translation buffer handled. It communicated through structured frequency shifts that the buffer converted to approximate meaning, and the approximations were often wrong in small ways that added up to large misunderstandings. Yara had spent 2 years mapping the drift patterns in those approximations. She had 3 pages of correction notes that she applied manually, which was why she was the only human in the station who could hold a substantive conversation with it. The collective had sent the frequency shift that the buffer translated as distress inquiry 40 minutes after the vote passed. Yara met it in the small, frequency-compatible chamber off the main corridor, a room that vibrated slightly at the resonant frequencies the collective used, which made Yara's back teeth ache after about 20 minutes. She sat in the one chair and set her thermos on the floor beside her. The collective's shift pattern opened with what the buffer would have called structural concern. Yara's notes said it was closer to the load-bearing element is no longer in position. I know, she said. The next shift pattern was more complex. The buffer would have said request for continuation protocol. Yara's notes said what holds the weight now. Your own teams, she said. We left them everything they need. The documentation is thorough. The collective held a frequency for a long moment. Long for the collective meant 3 seconds. When it resumed, the pattern was one Yara had never recorded before. Her correction notes didn't cover it. She sat with it for a moment, listening to the room vibrate, and worked it from its component parts. It meant something close to. We built our calculations on an assumption that was not an assumption. Yara looked at the wall of the chamber for a moment. Yes, she said. I know that too. She picked up her thermos and left before the 20-minute ache set in her jaw. The Velhari logistics office ran its final audit at the 90-day mark. Yara was not present for this. She was boarding Wanderer 1, the lead vessel of the 43-ship voluntary Exodus fleet, via a pressurized transfer bridge that smelled of sealant and the particular cold of deep transit prep. The ship was a converted long-haul carrier with a wide belly hold that had been restructured to carry soil, actual soil, in sealed culture bays, along with seeds, root stock, and the climate-controlled tanks that Clara Holt had been filling for the past 11 weeks. Captain Edward Park met her at the bridge access. He was a compact man with a habit of holding his hands behind his back when he was thinking through a problem, which meant his hands were behind his back now. Conclave Tracking Net has 22 active monitoring drones on our outer hull, he said. I know, Yara said. They're not illegal under the withdrawal terms. I know. They have a range of about 40 light seconds, past the border marker. Yara looked at him. Park's mouth made a small movement that was not quite a smile. After that, he said, we're past their maps entirely. No lane beacons, no relay markers, no charts. That is correct, Yara said. I wanted to make sure we were aligned, he said, on what that means. Yara set her journal on the navigation console and looked through the bridge viewport at the station behind them, amber-lit, enormous, perfectly organized. Somewhere in there, Counselor V was receiving the final audit and finding that the transition guides were exactly as complete as Yara had said they would be, and that this was not, actually, good news. It means, she said, that we know how to walk without someone else's maps. She picked up her journal. She sat down. The fleet detached from the refueling pylons at 400 station time. All 43 ships, simultaneously, with the quiet precision of a process that had been rehearsed. No communication burst to the Conclave tracking office. No formal farewell transmission. 43 vessels, and then the empty pylons where they had been. Botanist Clara Holt was in the soil bay checking humidity on the 4th row of culture tanks when she felt the detachment in her feet. She checked the reading. She went back to the humidity gauge. Some things needed doing, regardless. 4 days past the border marker, the Conclave's monitoring drones went dark. Captain Park noted it in the log and said nothing to the crew. There was nothing to say. The drones had reached their range limit. That was all. It was, technically, the first time in 40 years that any human vessel had been genuinely beyond the reach of every conclave sensor, and Park understood what that meant the same way he understood what it meant to take his hands out from behind his back. The problem he had been thinking through was done. He left his hands at his sides. On day 7, Captain Diana Cole, running deep-range passive sensors from the secondary scan station, flagged an anomaly that did not fit any category in the ship's database. Not a conclave relay, not a natural stellar source, not any kind of signal type the fleet's combined library could identify. She tagged it, ran 3 independent verification sweeps, and then said, in the flat tone of someone who has looked at something twice and is now looking at it a 3rd time because the first 2 times felt wrong, "This signal is structured." Park came to the scan station. He looked at the readout. "How old?" he asked. Cole ran the decay analysis. She looked at the number. She ran it again. She turned to Park. "Sir," she said, "it's older than the conclave." The signal did not repeat on a fixed interval. That was the first wrong thing about it. Every structured broadcast in the conclave's catalogued history, navigation beacons, relay pings, distress markers, operated on fixed cycles, because fixed cycles were efficient, and the galaxy, as far as the conclave had mapped it, preferred efficiency. This signal shifted, not randomly. The intervals changed in a pattern that Dr. Nadia Ross, elbows on the scan console, hair still flat from 6 hours of sleep, described as responsive. "It's adjusting to us," she said. "Every time we run a verification sweep, the interval shortens. It's been shortening since Cole first flagged it." Park stood behind her. "How much shorter?" "We started at roughly 40 minutes between pulses. We're down to 11. What happens when it reaches 0? Ross looked at her readout. "I think that's the wrong question," she said. "I think the question is what it does when it decides we've been listening long enough." She pulled up the decay analysis on the secondary screen. The age estimate was not a clean number. Decay analysis never was, but the range it gave was unambiguous. This structure had been broadcasting since before any species currently sitting on the conclave floor had achieved orbit. It had been broadcasting while the Velhari were still sorting out consensus governance. It had been broadcasting while the Keth were developing their mathematical notation systems. It had been broadcasting, quietly and without an audience, for the entire recorded history of organized galactic civilization. Nobody had heard it. Or rather, and this was the part that Ross kept returning to, setting down her stylus, picking it back up, nobody had heard it here. Out here, past the maps. Because out here was where it was, and the Conclave survey ships had never come out here without charts in hand, and the charts had always pointed elsewhere. "I want a bearing," Park said. 274, Cole said from the primary scan station. "Same as first contact. It hasn't moved." Park looked at the bearing on the navigation display for a long moment. Then he looked at Yara, who was sitting at the secondary console with her journal open and had been writing steadily since Ross began her report. "Ambassador," he said. "I heard," she said. She did not look up from her journal. "Your recommendation." She wrote one more line, closed the journal, looked at the bearing. "We go toward it," she said. The threshold vault appeared on the primary view screens on the 4th day of approach, and the first thing everyone noticed was that it was dark. Not unlit, not cold. Dark the way a thing is dark when it is choosing not to announce itself, absorbing the ambient light of the surrounding sector without reflecting it back, so that the eye kept sliding off its edges, and then returning, confused, because the thing was clearly there, and clearly enormous, and kept refusing to resolve into a shape the brain would accept. Yara sat at the viewport and looked at it for a long time. It was large, large in the way that made the fleet's 43 ships feel like dust motes beside a wall. The outer structure was geometric, not the organic curves of Velhari architecture, not the modular precision of Keth construction, but something older than either, built on proportions that felt almost familiar before the mind caught up with the scale and recalibrated. It had depth. It had interior lines visible even from this distance. It was not a ruin. It was waiting. "Active power signature," Ross said quietly from the scan station. "Not dormant, not emergency minimum. Full operational power. Whatever is running in there has been running without interruption for—" She stopped. "Say it," Yara said. For longer than I can verify with the equipment I have, Ross said. Park was standing again, hands behind his back, but they were still now. The problem in his mind had changed shape. Hull sensors, he said. Any response to our approach? Yes, Cole said. The outer structure has been doing something since we crossed the 4 light hour mark. There's a section on the facing side, I'm mapping it now, that is actively reconfiguring. Like a door. Silence on the bridge. Like a door. Yara opened her journal to a clean page. The outer lock opened 17 hours before they were close enough to dock. It did not open like a mechanism. Gears, pistons, the logic of a thing built to open and close. It opened the way a hand opens, with intention and some quality that the ship's sensors logged, and then filed under no category match, because the sensors were looking for force, and there was no force, only the slow, certain movement of something very old deciding to make room. The opening was human height, not approximately, not close. The threshold was 1.8 meters high and 70 centimeters wide, and the tolerances were so exact that Ross ran the measurement twice, and then asked Cole to run it independently, and Cole's numbers matched hers to the millimeter. The Conclave survey teams, Park said. Yes, Yara said. Their survey ships are not human proportioned, Yara said. Valhari construction standards run to 3 meters at the minimum threshold because of the dais. Keth teams move in heptad formations, so their equipment access is lateral, not vertical. She was writing as she spoke. The survey teams came with charts. The charts said this sector was unmapped, which the Conclave system treats as equivalent to empty. She finished the line in her journal. They measured the sector. They did not enter it. Park turned this over. The vault didn't reject them, he said slowly. No, Yara said. It simply required something their equipment didn't allow for. They couldn't have fit. She looked at the threshold on the view screen. We can. The fleet held station at 200 meters while Yara suited up. Not a full EVA suit. The corridor between the ship and the lock was pressurized enough for a transit suit, and ran through the checklist with Park in the departure bay. He did not try to send a security team ahead of her. She had already explained once why that would be wrong, and Park was the kind of man who only needed to hear a thing once if it made sense. She took her journal. She took her thermos, still a third full, the frontier-grown beans lasting longer than expected at careful rationing. She took nothing else. The threshold felt ordinary under her hand. Cool, slightly textured, the grain of it running horizontally the way wood grain runs, except it was not wood, and she did not have a word for what it was. She stepped through. The interior was blue-white, not bright. The light came from the walls themselves, even and sourceless, the kind of light that did not cast shadows because it came from everywhere at once. The floor was smooth and dark and vast, and the acoustics were strange. Her footsteps came back to her a fraction of a second late, as though the room were listening before it returned her sounds. She walked to the center. She set her thermos down on the floor. She opened her journal and wrote. The door was the right size. That was the first thing. Then the record form spoke. It did not speak in any language. Yara understood this intellectually before the experience made it clear. What the record form did was closer to what the Silicon Collective did with frequency shifts. It created conditions in the space around her that her mind assembled into meaning, the way the eye assembles the separate signals of color and depth into a single scene thing. The meaning was not words. It was more like the shape of a question. Did you come by choice? Not did someone send you? Not what are your credentials, your charter, your authorization codes? Not which governing body do you represent? Did you come by choice? Yara looked at the blue-white walls for a moment. Then she said, out loud in English, because she was not sure the record form cared about the language, and she wanted to be honest in the one she thought in. Yes. The room changed. Not physically, nothing moved, no new doors opened, no display activated. But the quality of the blue-white light shifted in a way that felt like settling, like a question resolved, like the room had been holding something carefully and had just set it down. Yara wrote in her journal, it asked one thing, I said yes. Then it started. What it started was not a presentation. It was not an archive tour. It was something closer to a conversation held by one side for 60,000 years, waiting for the other side to arrive. The record form gave her context in the way that context works in a room where two people already know the most important things about each other. Not from the beginning, not with preamble, but from the part that mattered. The builders had been here, before the Conclave, before the Velhari reached consensus governance, before the Keth developed their first counting systems. The builders had mapped this sector, not with charts, but with presence. They had come here because the dark past the known edges was where the real structure of things lived, and they had stayed long enough to leave something that could explain this to whoever arrived next. They had not stayed forever. They had moved on. Yara wrote steadily. Her handwriting did not change speed. There was one more thing the record form showed her toward the end of the first session. It was a record of surveys, not the builders' surveys, later ones. The Conclave's ancestors, moving through this sector in their enormous 3-meter threshold ships, scanning from a distance, logging unmapped and continuing on their charts. 17 separate surveys across 60,000 years, each one reaching this sector, each one finding nothing, because their instruments were looking for the things they expected, and the vault was not one of those things, each one turning back. One entry from a survey roughly 8,000 years ago had appended a single note in the earliest form of Velhari administrative script. Yara's translation of it, written in her journal in her cramped hand, read, "Sector unproductive. Advise no further resource allocation." She looked at that line for a long time. Then she heard footsteps behind her and turned and found that 42 hours had passed and 6 humans had quietly come in after her and were doing various things across the vault floor. 2 engineers were running sensor leads along the base of the eastern wall. Clara Holt was in the far corner with a soil tin, checking whether the floor material was compatible with terrestrial root anchors. 3 children from the civilian habitat section of the fleet were drawing on the smooth, dark floor with chalk. Simple lines, animals, shapes, and their chalk marks were staying, which meant the floor was not self-cleaning, which meant whoever built this had left it open to be marked. Yara looked at the chalk animals. She looked at the engineer's sensor, leads running along a power grid that had been live without interruption for longer than any civilization, currently keeping records. She wrote one more line in her journal and closed it. The Conclave tracking delegation arrived 17 days later. There were 3 ships, small, fast, the kind of vessels the Velhari used for administrative verification rather than military presence, which was either a sign of confidence or a sign that they had not yet decided what category this situation belonged in. They dropped out of transit at the outer edge of the sector and held position for 6 hours before broadcasting a hail on the standard Conclave frequency. Park took the hail in the bridge, standing with his hands at his sides. The lead vessel's communications officer read from what was clearly a prepared statement. It covered the voluntary nature of the tracking mission, the Conclave's continued administrative interest in the welfare of former member species, and the standard protocols for territorial inquiry in unmapped sectors. It was, Yara noted from the secondary console, 17 sentences long and contained no question. She waited for it to finish. "Standard acknowledgement," she told Park. "He sent it." The 3 ships moved closer. Slowly, the way things move when they want to demonstrate that they are not moving fast. They were close enough now that their sensor sweeps were hitting the vault's outer surface, and Yara could see from the fleet's passive monitoring that those sweeps were coming back, with readings that were making the tracking delegation systems work very hard to produce an output. The lead ship sent a second transmission. This one was not from the communications officer. Counselor V's voice came through the translation buffer, and under the buffer's smoothing Yara could hear, having spent years learning to hear it, the particular frequency in a Velhari voice that meant the fin folds had gone flat. "Ambassador Oe," he said, "we are reading an active structure at your coordinates. Our records indicate this sector as uncharted." "It is uncharted," Yara said. "We found it by coming here." A pause. "The structure is of considerable age." "Yes. Our survey records do not contain." "No," Yara said. "They don't." Another pause. Longer. "We would," Counselor V said carefully, "wish to discuss access protocols." Yara looked at the view screen, where the vault sat in its dark, patient way, absorbing the light of the surrounding sector. She picked up her thermos. She looked at it for a moment. She said, "I think that is a conversation we should have in person, Counselor. Come to the platform. I'll make coffee." The transmission ended. Park looked at her. "He's going to come," he said. Yes, she said. Because he has to. Because, she said, they built their charts on the assumption that everything worth finding had already been found. And now they're looking at proof that they were wrong, and it is the size of a small moon, and humans are living in it. She set the thermos down. He has to come because there is no form to file for this. Park looked at her for a moment longer, then turned back to his console. There was nothing else to say. The Conclave delegation was holding position 2 kilometers off the vault's outer face, and the vault sat between them and the fleet, the way a fact sits between two arguments, not hostile, not welcoming, simply present and immovable and older than the disagreement. Yara picked up her thermos and went to find Clara Holt. Clara was in the soil bay, the way she usually was, checking root moisture levels on the 4th culture row. The bay smelled like actual earth, not recycled mineral substrate, not synthetic growth medium, but soil that had been carried from a pressurized dome on a transit platform, and before that from a farm outside, Geneva, and before that from the ground itself, ordinary dark ground that had been growing things for as long as anyone had been planting them. Yara stood in the bay doorway and breathed it in for a moment. "He's coming," Yara said. Clara did not look up from her gauge. "I know, Park told me." She made a small adjustment to the moisture feed. "Do you want me to set up the platform table?" "Yes, the obsidian one, if it will transfer." "It'll transfer." Clara moved to the next row. "I'll need 20 minutes. Yara leaned against the doorframe and watched Clara check humidity gauges, moving down the row with the steady, unhurried rhythm of someone whose work did not change character based on what the diplomats were doing. 3 months ago, Clara had been loading vacuum-sealed soil tins onto a cot in the Conclave's botanical intake bay while a Keth monitor watched and said nothing. Now she was calibrating root moisture inside a structure that had been waiting for 60,000 years for someone to plant something in it. She had not, as far as Yara knew, found this remarkable. She had found it good soil. Yara looked at her thermos. There was enough left for 2 cups, maybe 3 if she was careful. She was going to need one of them. The open-air platform was not, precisely, open air. It was a section of the vault's outer hull that had reconfigured over the 17 days of human occupation, opening in sections, slowly, the way the threshold had opened, with that quality of intention rather than mechanism, until it created a space at the vault's edge where the interior light met the raw dark of unmapped space. There was no atmosphere barrier. There was something else, some field the fleet's sensors logged as pressure maintenance, origin unknown, that held the air in without a wall. Yara stood at the edge of the platform and looked out. The Conclave ships were small from here. 3 administrative vessels, built for speed and record-keeping, holding position in the dock with their running lights cycling through the standard amber that meant non-hostile approach. She had watched those lights for 40 years in stations and corridor junctions and negotiating chambers. Here they looked different. Here they looked like what they were, small lights in a very large dock, asking permission. She heard the transfer bridge seal behind her. She did not turn around. Counselor V's hover dais made its particular hum slightly higher pitched in the vault's gravity field than it had been on the station. She heard it stop 3 meters behind her. She heard the soft sound of his fin folds moving, the respiratory adjustment he made when he encountered an atmosphere his body was working to process. She poured a cup of coffee. She held it out without turning. A long pause. Then the mechanical sound of his dais adjusting height and the careful multi-jointed movement of his 7-fingered hand taking the cup. She poured the second cup for herself. Then she turned. Counselor V looked smaller here. Not physically. His coral carapace was the same, his dais at the same height, his fin folds moving with the same precise control she had watched for 11 years of sessions in the amber chamber. But the amber chamber had been built to make him large. This platform had not been built for anyone currently living, and so it made everything the same size, small, relative to what surrounded it. His fin folds were not crimson. They were not pale. They were a color she did not have a word for in Velhari color notation, something between the two, and she had never seen them that color before. He was looking at the thermos. "The customs office," he said, "filed 47 reports about that object." "I know," Yara said. "I read them. They classified it as a potential biological agent. They classified everything they couldn't replicate as a potential biological agent," she said. "That was in the methodology notes." He looked at the cup in his hands. The dark surface of the coffee reflected the vault's blue-white light back at him in a way that made it look, briefly, like a piece of unmapped space held in ceramic. "This structure," he said. "The age of it." "Yes. Our survey teams passed this sector 17 times," Yara said. "The most recent was 8,000 years ago. The notation in the record was unproductive." His fin folds moved. "They were looking for what they expected," Yara said. "They had charts. The charts told them what the sector should contain, and the sector didn't match the charts, so they logged it as empty and moved on." "And you?" "We had no charts," she said. "You voted to remove us from the lane system. We had no beacons, no relay markers, no approved corridors. We came out here because out here was where there was room." She looked at the vault behind them, at the blue-white light coming through the open sections of its hull, at the faint sound of children's voices somewhere in its interior. It turns out that was the exact credential required. Counselor V held the cup with both hands. He stared at the dark surface. "We will need to discuss access," he said. "Yes," Yara said. "We will. The Conclave has a jurisdictional interest in any structure of this age within mapped space," Yara said. "This is unmapped space. The distinction is the entire point," she said. "Counselor, you voted to remove humanity from civilized space. We accepted that vote. We left completely within the terms of the resolution. We are now in space your own maps classify as empty. You have no jurisdiction here. What you have is a request." His fin folds went flat. "You mistook our willingness to coordinate," she said, "for a necessity to submit." The platform was quiet. The dark outside, it was enormous. The vault's light came from everywhere and cast no shadows. Counselor V looked at the cup for a long time. Then he said, "What are your terms?" Yara set her own cup down on the edge of the platform's obsidian table and opened her journal to the page she had written on the first morning inside the vault. She did not rush. She read from the journal the way she did everything, steadily, without performance, with the careful precision of someone who had written the words down by hand because she had wanted to be sure of them before she said them out loud. The terms were not long. They did not need to be. Humanity was sovereign in unmapped space, full stop. Any conclave presence in unmapped sectors required bilateral agreement with the human sovereign authority, not a petition, not a filing, not an application. An agreement between equals. The conclave would acknowledge, in a signed instrument, that humanity's withdrawal had been voluntary and complete, that no outstanding obligations existed on either side, and that the relationship going forward was between two independent entities with no hierarchical arrangement. "And the vault?" Counselor V asked. "The vault is not mine to negotiate," Yara said. "The vault belongs to the people who built it and to whoever they intended to find it. We are the people who found it. That is a separate matter from the treaty. The Conclave would wish to send a delegation that can fit through the threshold," Yara said. "Build smaller ships, arrive without charts, ask to come rather than filing for access." She closed her journal. "Those are not my requirements. Those are the vault's." Counselor V was very still. Then slowly his fin folds settled. Not relief, not defeat. Something more careful than both. The look of a mind accepting a new category after a long resistance. "We will need to consult the assembly," he said. "Of course," Yara said. "The process will take time." "We are not going anywhere," she said. "We live here now." She picked up her thermos. The last of the coffee was cold, but she poured it anyway into her cup, not his, and drank it standing at the platform's edge, looking at the 3 small amber lights of the conclave vessels in the dark. No one raised a weapon. No one threatened a thing. She had simply handed them a document and a cup of something they couldn't replicate, and waited for them to understand what the math meant. They had voted for a vacuum. They received physics. The treaty signing happened 11 days later, on the platform, on the obsidian table, with the vault's blue-white light coming through the open hull sections and laying itself over everything without preference. Counselor V signed with a stylus from his administrative kit. Yara signed with her pen, the same one she used in her journal, a plain metal barrel, ink-filled, bought from a supply vendor on the outer station 3 years ago. She had not planned this as a statement either. Clerk Tuv was present. The conclave required a witnessed record, and Tuv was the administrative officer attached to V's delegation. He stood at the table's corner with his recording slate, his respiratory vents cycling at their normal pace, and when the signing was complete, he filed the record with the standard notation, bilateral instrument, filed under, new categories. He had come up with that classification himself. Yara noticed that and wrote it in her journal. Clara Holt had anchored the first farm dome to the vault's exterior hull on day 9, before the treaty, because the route schedules did not wait for diplomacy. The dome sat on the hull's lower-facing side, pressurized and lit with the warm spectrum glow lighting that the terrestrial succulents required. From the platform, it was visible as a small bubble of yellow warm light against the vault's absorbed dark, the two colors sitting together without competing. Yara stood at the platform edge on the evening of the signing and looked at it. She looked at the 3 conclave ships, smaller now, pulling back to transit distance. She looked at the fleet's 43 vessels, some of them already reconfiguring for long-term station rather than transit, hull sections opening to dock with the vault's exterior anchoring points. She looked at the chalk marks on the vault floor, visible through the open hull section below her, still there, animals and lines, and whatever the children had decided to draw, marked into a floor that had been waiting for 60,000 years for something to be written on it. Her thermos was empty. She turned it in her hands. The ceramic was warm from being held, the dark surface showing her own reflection back at her, small and clear. She set it on the table. That night, Ross came to find her in the vault's interior, where Yara had gone back to sit with the record form for what had become an evening routine. Ross did not interrupt the session. She waited, sitting cross-legged on the floor near the threshold with her tablet in her lap, until the blue-white light settled back to its ambient level, and Yara stood and rolled her signet ring around her thumb. "Something new on the deep-range sensors," Ross said. Yara looked at her. "Not one signal this time," Ross said. She turned the tablet so Yara could see it. 3, coming from different bearings, structured like the first one. Old, I can't get a clean age reading yet, but the decay signature is in the same range. Yara looked at the tablet. 3 bearings, 3 structures, somewhere in the dark past the edge of what anyone had mapped, broadcasting in patterns that shifted when a listening ship came close, waiting for someone to arrive without a chart and ask to enter. She did not say anything for a long time. Then she opened her journal to a new page. She wrote 3 bearings. She wrote one word under them. Next. She closed the journal, picked it up, and walked back through the vault toward the platform, where the farm dome's yellow light was still on, and the dark outside was full of signals that the conclave had never heard because it had not thought to look, and the children's chalk drawings were still on the floor, and the empty thermos was on the obsidian table, and the treaty was signed, and none of that meant they were done.